Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first event of the Race and Place Learning from the Past and Looking to the Future series. Today's guest, Michael Corey, will be presenting on The Process is the Product, how Mapping Prejudice uses community co-creation for reparative change. My name is Jerica Logan, and I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA. I will be your host for this event. If you require a closed captioning, you will find a box in the bottom of the screen called CC. Click on the box and select Show Subtitles. This will allow you to see subtitles during the presentation. Please feel free to submit questions at any time using the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion of the presentation. And if we do not get to your question, we do apologize. If you have any additional questions following this event, please feel free to email me at logan.433@osu.edu. This event is approved for one AICP CM. To claim your CM credits, log into your My APA account on the APA website and enter into your online event log. There will also be a brief survey at the end of this webinar. If you have time, please provide your feedback. To learn more about CURA's future events or to sign up for our monthly newsletter, please visit cura.osu.edu. You can also like CURA on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. I am now going to pass it over to Josh Sadvardi.
Thanks, Jerica, and welcome to today's webinar, everyone. My name is Josh Sadvari, and I'm the Geospatial Information Librarian at Ohio State. I'll be introducing today's speaker and moderating the Q&A. The Race and Place Summer Series is co-sponsored by the University Libraries Research Commons, and this program is a part of CURA's regular series on issues and challenges facing the cities and regions in Ohio and beyond. Don't miss our next webinar in the Race and Place Summer Series, Landscapes of Erasure with Latoya Gray Sparks on June 16th. You can visit cura.osu.edu/events to learn more and register, and to see the great sessions we have planned for July and August as well. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today, Michael Corey, who is the Geospatial Technical and Data Lead and Associate Director for Mapping Prejudice. Michael's primary role is to design, build, and maintain the Deed Machine, Mapping Prejudice's technical platform for identifying and mapping racial covenants, as well as to work with community partners and public records custodians to facilitate more racial covenants research. Michael is also a master's student in the University of Minnesota's Heritage Studies and Public History program. Before transitioning to public history, Michael spent 20 years as a journalist and data journalist at the Star Tribune, Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting, and the Des Moines Register. His journalism work spanned zoning and segregation, mortgage disparities, the US-Mexico border fence system, human-induced earthquakes, and sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Michael, we're very happy to have you with us today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much for having me, everybody, and I'm assuming you can hear me, so let me know if that's not true. I am just delighted to be here. It's been a long time since I've been on OSU's campus. A long time ago in the year 2000, I interned for a summer at the Columbus Dispatch, so I am told that the campus has changed a lot, so someday I'll have to get back. So before I start, I want to give a quick preface that, like, because of the subject matter today, we're dealing with racial covenants. We're going to both see and hear some racist language today, and I just want to make sure that people are prepared for that. We're doing it for a reason, and we'll talk about that reason. But if at any point that is too much for somebody, that is completely understandable. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If you need to step off for a minute, that's totally cool. But I just want to prepare people that is coming. In 2016, the founders of Mapping Prejudice came together with a small group of volunteers to start the project at the University of Minnesota Libraries. This is before my time. And together they resolved to do something that no one had ever done before, and that was to build the first ever comprehensive map of racial covenants for an American city. Racial covenants are clauses that were inserted into property records to keep people who were not white from buying or occupying certain pieces of land. This mission required the combined skills of a property records researcher, a creative GIS specialist, a map librarian with deep expertise in digital cartography, who by the way is on this call, Ryan Mackey, data curation and project management, and a public historian. And what started as an experiment has grown into an award-winning and cutting-edge geospatial research project that uses digital tools to open up new avenues for education, scholarship, community dialogue, and policymaking. Though Mapping Prejudice started as a fixed-term mapping project for one city, 7 years later, it has transitioned into an ongoing vehicle for racial justice within the University of Minnesota libraries. So this is an example of a racial covenant, and I want to start out by just sort of talking about what we're talking about. And so I'm going to read the detailed language here. The party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. And then it's cut off a little bit here, but it continues. Said restrictions and covenants shall run with the land. And this is the earliest racial covenant that we have found in Minnesota, and it's from South Minneapolis in 1910. One of the things I think that people assume about racial covenants is that these must be on like really big houses or the nicest houses. That's not generally what we find, although there are some nice houses that have them. This is from a very modest property that was owned by Henry and Lenora Scott, and they sold this property to Nels Anderson, a Swedish baker. There's a chicken coop out back of the house. And yeah, I think what we find most often is that racial covenants are placed on houses that are sort of in the middle of the housing market as sort of an amenity that is meant to attract more buyers. Here's another example. This one is from Benton County, which is St. Cloud is part of Benton County in Minnesota. This one, said premises shall not be sold, leased, or rented or occupied by any person of the Negro, Oriental, Semitic, or Indian races, or who has the blood of any said races, except as limited by present laws or treaties. And this was found by, not by Mapping Prejudice, but by a researcher at the College of St. Benedict in Minnesota, Professor Brittany Merritt, and her students. And one thing, the reason I want to show this is this includes a direct targeting of indigenous people by racial covenants. And that's important. And we also see racial covenants as part of a longer story of both continuous waves of displacement that did not start in the 20th century and the overall racialization of space in the American context. And what you can see here in both of these examples is you sort of have this list of who can't live in places. And some of these terms are sort of legible to us today. And some of them don't necessarily make a lot of sense. I mean, so some people are probably familiar with the use of the term Mongolian, for example, but some people aren't. And to understand some of these terms that are being used here, you have to understand something about 19th and early 20th century racial science that said that people all come from sort of like master, like overall racial categories. And the reason I bring this up is because I think that sometimes there's a temptation to say that we know specifically who is being targeted by each restriction. But Mongolian is an example where that definitely would include Asian people, but Mongolian also could refer to Native American people. And so as we're interpreting racial covenants, it's important that we keep in mind that the meanings of these things are shifting over time. And you can also see here the word Semitic, so Jewish people are targeted by racial covenants also. But I want to call out that basically every covenant that we have ever seen targets Black people, and that's something to understand is that the targeting of Black people and the anti-Blackness in housing is sort of a overarching and phenomenon that should be considered as sort of a separate and more all-pervading thing than other racial groups will sort of come and go. But these vary by region, and this varies by what different people are concerned about in their communities. So here's another one. No persons of any race other than the Aryan race shall use or occupy any building or any lot. And the reason I show this one a lot is because you can see sort of, again, a transition in the racial language. But this one in particular, this one is from 1946. This is just after we finished the Second World War. fighting against people who thought about people as Aryans. And so I show this to show that like this is not just something that this is not a simple story, and that these prejudices persist longer than some people might think. And here's one more I want to show. This one is from 1919, and this is from Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Said premises shall never be occupied by a colored person. And this is the racial covenant that was on my parents' house in Eau Claire. And I want to share this for two reasons. One is because I want to talk about my own positionality as a white person who has frankly benefited from these practices in the past, but also to talk about my reaction to when I learned about this. And I learned about the racial covenant on my parents' house when I was about 12 years old, and my parents were refinancing their mortgage. And I'm not sure if they spotted it or the mortgage broker spotted it, but they said, "Oh, and did you know that our house could never be bought by a Black person?" And at the time, I remember thinking, well, what a strange thing. Like, there's not even any Black people here. And what I want to illustrate about that is that the fact that those two things were connected did not occur to me at all. And I don't say that to excuse myself, but I think that's it's important to see that these things were so effective in establishing white spaces that someone like me couldn't even perceive of a different way of a neighborhood that was not a almost exclusively white neighborhood. That's how effective these things were. But why didn't I know about these things? They weren't a secret. And what I didn't know about these restrictions is that it wasn't just my house. It was likely every house on the block. And actually the covenant was put in place before the houses were there. And the way that racial covenants usually work is that in Minnesota and in the upper Midwest so far that we've seen, it's a little different in some other cities. But in Minnesota, at least, the covenants go in and on most of an entire subdivision at one time when someone decides to sell off some land for a subdivision or for residential properties, because just putting a racial covenant on one property doesn't really do very much. But so people want to covenant the entire neighborhood to establish this white space. And the other thing I didn't understand is that it wasn't just my house or it wasn't just my neighborhood. It was vast areas of lots of communities. And basically anytime anyone has ever looked, they found racial covenants. What we're looking at right now is a heat map showing racial covenants developing over time in the Twin Cities. This is the compilation of our work in the Twin Cities so far. And what you can see is that these sort of start in like 1910. What we have a sort of initial peak in 1925 that starts to fall off as the Depression takes hold. And then you see sort of a second peak coming out of World War II as there are acute housing shortages and then housing booms. And then as white people move out to the suburbs into these newly built subdivisions that have racial covenants, people of other races are mostly not able to follow that. And that's one of the dynamics we see. And the data that undergirds this map really gives lie to the collective myth that the North never had any kind of formal segregation, or that racial disparities had grown out of some kind of natural order or set of personal choices. And again, like, it's a mystery. We should talk about why we didn't know about these things, because again, these were not secret at the time. This is a newspaper ad that was in the St. Paul paper. This one is, I don't have my year written down here, but in the teens, where the text of the covenants were directly written in newspapers as amenities. It says here, fourth, that grantee cannot sell or lease said real estate to a colored person. You have my assurance that the above restrictions will be enforced to the fullest extent of the law. This one is from Como Park in St. Paul, and it was put in place by Thomas Frankson. And Thomas Frankson wasn't just anybody. Thomas Frankson was a legislator in Minnesota, and later he was the lieutenant governor. And so when he said that we're going to enforce this to the full extent of the law, that meant something. And I think another thing that people have said from time to time is, well, you know, this is just about economics, and this is other immigrant groups had it hard, right? And no one's saying that other immigrant groups didn't face challenges. This is the same ad from the same time period in St. Paul, but this time the ad is in Swedish, and the same text of the covenant is repeated in Swedish, and the inclusion of the language about enforcing the law. And so this is a great example of how Swedish people, even though they were new immigrants, were welcomed in to this emerging regime of whiteness where they could participate, but other racialized groups could not. And I think that that's important to understand too. And the other and what we understand in our research is that covenants are sort of one of the earlier stages of this ongoing process in the establishing of residential segregation that we still see today. But it's not just covenants. After covenants, or partly because of covenants, people of color are forced to live in only a small number of areas in a community where previously, even though in Minnesota, for example, we didn't have very large populations of Black people, but we did have Black people who were able to settle in most areas of the Twin Cities until about the teens and the 20s. And people are gradually forced to live in fewer and fewer places. That then gives them the opportunity to be circled on a map and redlined where these neighborhoods that have covenants are get investment in them, and neighborhoods that are redlined are divested from. But there's also mortgage discrimination, which was not actually illegal until the 1970s. The GI Bill is an interesting moment because this is both when a lot of white people's families get a foot on the rung of property ownership, the property ownership ladder, and particularly Black people are largely excluded from these opportunities. So it's not just that the history of racism is of people having things taken away from them, it's that at the same time, white people get a leg up. There's also neighborhood steering, urban renewal, freeways, and community violence, which works hand in hand with racial covenants. Some people, well, sorry, the major endpoint of racial covenants that we know of is the 1968 passage of the Fair Housing Act. We might find some that are still being recorded after that, but that's generally regarded as the end of the era of covenants. And so some people have wondered, why are we bothering to map these things that have been illegal since 1968? And some people dismissed our investigation as a waste of time. They thought it was sort of this like counting of an antiquarian, long illegal practice. Covenants are in the dustbin of history, so why put all this work into figuring out where they were and what they said? But we really believed that the map gives people in Minneapolis a new frame for understanding contemporary inequalities. And it's a way to explain how our city, which had a reputation for progressive politics, had developed some of the largest racial disparities in the country. And we also hope that it'd be helpful for people who wanted to dismantle structural racism to understand how it was constructed in the first place. And if you look at the Twin Cities, once these patterns established by racial covenants were put into place, they've remained really entrenched. So more than 50 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, the areas that once had racial covenants are still overwhelmingly white. And we can see this in the gap in home ownership in the Twin Cities, which is one of the largest in the nation, where in the Twin Cities or metro area, 76% of white families own their home, only 28% of Black families own their home. And this is significant because, as everyone on this call knows, housing is so foundational for well-being. Access to housing is literally a matter of life and death. A recent report from the state of Minnesota found that people who have been unhoused, no matter their age, their gender, or their race, are 3 times as likely to die than the general population. But even if you have shelter, the quality of your housing can determine whether you will be healthy or sick, and your location shapes your access to education. The kind of housing you have determines whether your family will be able to amass wealth and whether you'll be able to pass on that wealth to the next generation. And what we see in this history is that access to housing has been deliberately restricted in the United States. Racial covenants were a powerful tool for people who wanted to do this. And again, again, bringing into the contemporary, this is research done by our collaborator, Arad Yassoud, an economist at the University of Toronto, and my predecessor, Kevin Erman Solberg, that shows that a few years ago in Minneapolis, houses that had covenants were worth 15% more than non-covenanted houses, and redline homes were worth 25% less than the median value for homes in the area. And so again, this is an example. It's not just that people were kept out, it's that people who live in these covenanted neighborhoods today are still materially, monetarily benefiting from these covenants. And that's an important thing to consider as we think about what to do next. So how do we find these covenants? We have sort of a multi-step process that we go through. We start by getting digitized images of property records from a county, and we'll generally say we want your deeds, we want your plat maps, we want your agreements, and hopefully their microfilm has been scanned. We don't need the text. We actually do optical character recognition on our own, but we basically get these bulk records, and then we run them through our process that we call the deed machine, We OCR the text to extract the text from the documents. We then do a term search to determine if we think there are racial covenants there. We then upload the documents to our Zooniverse crowdsourcing platform, where 5 volunteers read each document, and I'll talk more about why we do that. And then after our volunteers have transcribed the records, we map the covenants to a modern parcel map. And we do this by harnessing the power of the community. In Hennepin County, we had 3,000 volunteers who read 177,000 historic property deeds. And overall today, Mapping Prejudice has had more than 8,000 volunteers reading property records. When we started out doing transcription sessions, this is one of our transcription sessions, we did them in person and they're to bring people together. And when the pandemic hit, and again, this is before my time, we felt like we maybe were a little stuck. Like, how are we going to have these transcription sessions? But what we actually found is that moving those transcription sessions online to Zoom actually worked a lot better. And also we were able to provide resources for teachers who were looking for ways to lead remote learning. And our digital platforms allowed teachers from all over the country to start incorporating Mapping Prejudice into their classes. And then a little more than 2 months into the pandemic lockdown, the world split open again when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And the combination of the people being stuck at home from the pandemic and people really wanting to find something positive to do with their time that was related to racial justice really supercharged the volunteer effort for Mapping Prejudice, and we were getting thousands and thousands of volunteer transcriptions a day. I think the peak was something like 2,000 to 3,000 people or transcriptions on a single day. And people just really wanted to understand why this had exploded in Minneapolis. And for people who know Minneapolis, that's really why this has exploded again in Minneapolis. The people wanted to understand what was going on. And what we have learned in these transcription sessions is that the secret sauce of Mapping Prejudice is this co-creation with our volunteers. And this is what makes our mantra, the process is the product. And I'm going to probably say this a number of more times during this presentation. I want to emphasize that these documents have a different impact depending on your lived experience. For many white people who are encountering a racial covenant or the idea of racial covenant in our transcription sessions for the first time, it's revelatory. People often tell me, I didn't know about this. And as I said, that was sort of my experiences until I discovered that there was one in my parents' house. I didn't know that this was a thing. And even when I did, I didn't know the context for them. But for people who lived with the consequences of racial covenants, they did know, even if they were not fully aware of the details of these practices. And people targeted by these racist restrictions often tell us that it's affirming to hear this history documented and acknowledged in this way. And I want to emphasize that is not, like, not everyone has the same experience, but that is something we hear quite often. And that racial covenants show, in the words of Ibrahim X. Kendi, the racism behind the racial disparities. And a thing that we hear from volunteers all the time, and this has been my experience as well, is that there are a lot of white people who like conceptually know about racism, but when they're looking for individual examples of racism, there's always a little voice in your head that says, well, you know, maybe some of it's this and maybe some of it's this. But with racial covenants, it's completely unambiguous. Like there's no other interpretation of this history other than this is racial exclusion. And our volunteers have taught us that it was these sessions, this crowdsourcing, that is doing the work that we originally thought would be done by the finished map. And this has really been the hardest point for us to convey to other researchers around the country who contact us looking for advice on how to replicate our work in their communities. And for teachers, this is nothing new. We know that primary sources prompt active learning. But seeing the way that this works when you try to make your whole community into your classroom, that's really pushed us to think in new ways about how people assimilate new information. And public historians have got to acknowledge that the digital revolution has brought changes in how knowledge transmission works most effectively. And as Clay Shirky talks about it, the people formerly known as the audience have the expectation that they will get to play an active role in the production of culture and knowledge. And people are not content to be passive recipients of information. And to some extent, this has probably always been true, but for sure it's the case now, that to assimilate a new concept, people need to be involved in the construction. And at a moment when our collective trust in institutions is really at an all-time low, we know it's not enough to just tell people that the urban landscape is defined by racial privilege. If we want to build political will for change, the people we are trying to reach need to be involved in and they need to be stakeholders in the effort of this history making. And again, this is again why we say the process is the product. And these are some quotes from our volunteers, and I'll read some of them. This is super tough to read. It makes me emotional, and it counters that narrative that the racism is imagined or doesn't exist. One volunteer said that it was revelatory, so matter of fact, that it counters that narrative of, you just got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. I wasn't surprised that happened, but to actually see it was eye-opening. And our volunteers have taught us that just mapping is not the goal. The real goal and the secret to mapping prejudice's success is the experience of encountering primary sources that our volunteers have together. And that's where they absorb that new information and what opens up people to new possibilities for reparative change. The other thing people ask us all the time is, okay, now I know about this history and what do I do next? So our advice on this is to tell your friends and family what you've learned, help research restrictive covenants and violence in your community. And if you want to, we are currently transcribing racial covenants in both Milwaukee and Dakota County, Minnesota, with more on the way. So we'd love to see you at a transcription session. And this is a big one, I think, for the people on this call, especially. Be honest about your institution's role in historically racist practices. And this is something I've seen amazing transformations on this. And to me, like, for example, last year, the Minneapolis Area Realtors Association actually apologized for historic racist practices among realtors. And an apology by itself, that doesn't necessarily change anything. But to me, still, it's been incredible to see people actually acknowledge overtly that this happened. Another big one for us is take guidance on what to do next from the people living with the consequences of these policies. I think something we have heard from community members from time to time is it's really nice that now people are paying attention to the history of racial covenants because these, frankly, mostly white researchers from the University of Minnesota are talking about it. But we've been talking about this for a long, long time. In the 1940s, the major target of activism among the NAACP was racial covenants, and the NAACP's activism around racial covenants is what led to the 1948 Shelley v. Kramer House that made them at least partially unenforceable. So again, it's like we need to be asking ourselves, why haven't we been listening before, and who should we be listening to now? Support conversations about reparations. I think that's the other lesson of Mapping Prejudice, is that if you look at the totality of this history, I don't think there's really any conclusion other than that slow systemic change or slow organic change is not going to fix this. Market forces are not going to fix it. These patterns are baked in, and if we keep leaving things to go the way they are, there's every reason to believe they will continue to get worse. For example, the Black home ownership rate today is lower than the Black home ownership rate was in 1968. And you can also learn about discharging your racial covenant. And discharge is a concept we like to talk about because right now there's a movement in a lot of quarters to, now that people are learning about racial covenants, people who find that these are on their homes are naturally horrified and they want to do something about it. But we want to make sure that if people want to address the racial covenants that are on their property records, we really have to be careful about what are we doing and why are we doing it. And in Minnesota, the law around what to do with your racial covenants is, we think, really a model where what we do is when a homeowner goes to discharge their racial covenant, they're not deleting anything from the record. They're actually adding another record to their chain of title that says, this happened, this was here, here's where to find it, but we're disavowing this history. And so first and foremost, it's important that we don't pass new policies that essentially erase this history. And that hopefully if anyone is going to go looking for racial covenants, that they are telling people about them and making their location publicly available, which takes extra work, as we know well, but it's a really important part of the process. So another question we get from time to time is, okay, so you need to map these things, but why is that so hard? You got all the property records. So, but moving from historic property records to modern property records is challenging for a number of reasons. The biggest reason is that, and this is something I didn't know, even though I was a journalist for a long time and covered and used property records, I didn't understand that the deeds themselves almost never include the address of the property. And so if we want to map these things, we need to find another way to map them. And what we use is what's present in a lot of places, particularly in sort of like newer cities. This combination of the addition, block, and lot. So here, this property record is talking about a property that's in the Norwood subdivision. That's the addition, excuse me. Block 10 and lot 37. And so we have to find a way to match that up with our modern property records. But the problem is property records don't do that. And you can see some sort of examples where here's a subdivision where we've mapped a lot of covenants in the subdivision. And because we know like these houses are all have covenants, probably these ones that don't have covenants marked probably do too. So no problem, we can just get the records from the next property over, right? But if anyone here works for property records, you know that that's not how property records work. Property records are organized in sequential date order, not geospatial order. And so if you want to, it's very difficult with historic records to search geographically. And this has been one of the major obstacles to finding racial covenants. Property records are also designed to determine ownership and give someone a clean title when they purchase a home. And they're designed to work with one property at a time, not really with like a bulk, any kind of bulk analysis in the same way that modern GIS works today. Also, a thing that we found is that if you're using title records from a title company, in a lot of places, title searches only go back a certain number of years. In Minnesota, sometimes we're told it only goes back 40 years. So if you just do a title search on your property, you might not immediately find a racial covenant, even if it's there. And I just like to show this slide. This is from a 1947 report on racial injustice in housing. And I just wanted to call out that even in 1947, people were trying to find out where the racial covenants were while these covenants were still in effect. And as this report put it, literally it would require years of work to determine the precise number of such covenants in the Twin Cities. And we are here to testify that, yes, that is indeed true, but it is now much more possible than it used to be. And the way that we map covenants is we want to get really granular data, property by property. And we're very fortunate in Minnesota and in the other places we're working where the records have been digitized that we can do that. There are in other communities where the records have not all been digitized. Sometimes the mapping work gets done sort of at a subdivision level. And that's certainly better than not doing the mapping at all. But we really have seen that mapping property by property is really valuable for a couple of reasons. One is that it allows other researchers like economists to do additional research that's not bound by these sort of like larger geographies. You can really get granular with stuff. And also people who want to discharge a covenant on their property, we want to be really sure that there's a covenant there. We think there's a really high penalty for telling someone your house has a covenant if it doesn't really have a covenant. So we're pretty conservative about what we map. And so the secret to our mapping process is that we have sort of like this automated simplification process for joining historic records to modern records. And then we have code that runs on each individual property ID that comes back from our volunteers. And so, for example, in the historic property records, we might get something back from our volunteers that says this property is John Smith, second addition to the city of St. Paul, block 2, lots 1 to 3. And when we run stuff through the deed machine, that will take that property information and generate what we call join strings. And so we've simplified this combination to get rid of things like addition to the city of St. Paul, which is probably not going to be repeated in the same form, and so just simplify down the definition of this lot. And then separately, we've uploaded a modern parcel shapefile into the deed machine. And so, for example, here you might see this is the same addition, but in the modern parcel records, it's called John Smith second ADD''N, block 2, lot 2. But if we run those through the same filters, that's again going to simplify that down to John Smith second, block 2, lot 2. And once those things have been simplified, we can run our automated joining process. And in the Twin Cities, we've been pretty lucky about that. Like we generally, when we get our transcriptions back, we can kind of automatically map about, I would say 70% of the properties. And then the rest of it, we have to do some manual cleanup. And we sort of have this iterative process that the system kind of learns as it goes. You can put in sort of exceptions and alternate plat names, and that allows us to progressively map more and more until we never get to 100%, and that's something to understand too. Covenants on unplatted land are really difficult to map, but there definitely are covenants on unplatted land. So why crowdsourcing though? Like, why don't we just get an AI to do this, right? This is an example of our Milwaukee work where we had 26,000 initial hits. That requires about 130,000 minutes of time, which would be if you had a single research. And actually, this goes to both the question of why not AI and also why not expert. Why don't you just have your grad students do this, right? It would take 108 weeks at 20 hours a week if you did nothing else, no bathroom breaks, and really notably no error checking. And the reason we show each of our property records to 5 individuals is so that we can then automatically compare what they said. And so we have very high confidence if everyone agrees that yes, there's a covenant and here's the date and that all matches. We can be very confident that we've got the right answer in a way that even the best expert data entry person, they're going to make typos. And if you only have one person doing this with no error checking, you have no way of knowing that. And most importantly of all, you cannot scale that expert process up to 3,100 counties in the United States. So we really firmly believe, and there's evidence to prove, that crowdsourcing is more accurate than expert transcription. And as I mentioned, we've had more than 8,000 volunteers do our work. And you can really get hundreds of transcriptions per day going, and even our peak of about 2,000 after George Floyd was murdered, which if you think that's time where we have to do community engagement to generate those volunteers, but mostly that happens in the background with us having to be involved. I'm not going to talk about that. And at the end stage of our process, we output our data into the same format for every county, where we've got we have a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to produce this data. And for every county, we have spreadsheet data, shapefile data, and GeoJSON data. And we feel like it's really important to have everything be in the same format. So again, researchers can simply pull together data from multiple counties to do analysis that's apples to apples. And we are, as part of our NEH grant, we're going to open source our software platform at the end of the summer. So stay tuned for that. And I'll say with this that it's going to be a while before this is software that is super easy to install, but that's something we're actively working on, is how do we make this fairly complex suite of tools easier for and more realistic for either a set of volunteer researchers or a government or something like that to be able to use it. But stay tuned. And I know I need to be done here in a second so we can switch to Q&A. But if you're wondering what do you need to do this in your community, you need digital images of the historic property records custodians who understand that these are public records and who want to help you with this stuff. If your county has a lot of unplatted land, that's something to know going in, that it might be difficult to map these things. And again, a really big thing is you need to be willing to do the community engagement to generate the volunteers that sort of builds over time, and you develop a critical mass of people to do that transcription work. But if you build it, they will come, we promise. So that's worth doing. And then particularly if you're going to use the Zooniverse platform, but just generally, you need to be committed to open access for the resulting data and maps. And we're not the only people doing this research. There's actually a coalition called the National Covenants Research Coalition of lots of different organizations of lots of different sizes working in communities around the country. These are just a couple, but you can look on their website to see if there's one near you. And I'll stop here. We'd love to see you at a volunteer session sometime. This is a QR code to join one of our You can either join one of our weekly, I guess during the summer, it's going to be bi-weekly transcription sessions, or you can watch our training video and learn how to do it on your own. And we would love to see you there. So thanks. With that, I'll turn it back over.
Thanks so much, Michael, for this presentation. We do have a few questions coming into the Q&A that we'll get to momentarily, and I'll invite others. If you have a question for Michael, please pop it in the Q&A. I do want to start with a comment, though, from one of our attendees. Narissa Rush says, Michael, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I started my undergrad at Minnesota in 2017, moved to Columbus for grad school in 2020, following Mapping Prejudice. Much of that time living in Minneapolis, was able to see the lasting legacy of these covenants and learn new things at all of these presentations. Really impressed by the work that your group is doing. And then ends with saying, I hope that Ohio State may take the lead from Mapping Prejudice and examine our city's history of racial segregation. And so I wanted to kind of follow up on that. You talked just moments ago about sort of the prerequisites that are needed for beginning a project like this one. And I'm just wondering what kind of maybe guidance you would give to, whether it be researchers, professionals in an area, activists in an area. What are some of the guidance that you might give those groups for determining whether these prerequisites exist, and if they do, next steps, or if they don't exist, mobilizing maybe to move in this direction?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And it's, I'd say there's a couple different things I would say. One is that if you're going to tackle this, you need to understand this is not something you're going to get done in 6 months. This is not something you're going to do in a single class session. You need to understand that this is going to be a multi-year process. And like part of that is just getting access to the records if they even exist in the form that you need to. And we've had some counties where we asked for the records and they pushed a hard drive across the table. It's very simple. By contrast, it took us 3 years to get Milwaukee deeds in the format we needed. So that's the first thing to understand, is this is going to be an ongoing process. And partly because of that, you also need to understand that this is not something that someone can do alone. We firmly believe there's a number of reasons you need to have a coalition and community buy-in to do this work. One is just because one person will just, if you have this relying on one person, inevitably that person's going to move on or get burned out. And so you need to share the load. There's also a diverse range of skills that you need to do this work. There is the community engagement to generate volunteers. There's this knowledge of property records, local historical expertise. But most importantly, you need community buy-in, and you need guidance from your community about what they want to get out of this process. And we try really hard to not go places where we're not invited, and that has gotten us a long way in terms of, at least so far, avoiding major pushback on this. But I think particularly if you're trying to get these public records in bulk, which if your local records office is not accustomed to that kind of bulk request, they're not going to be happy to see you necessarily. Like if you get lucky, that'd be great. But I think like being able to say like there is community demand for us to do this work, there's genuine community interest in that, that's going to make that a lot easier. It both puts pressure on them, but also I think they generally want to help, like if this is a genuine community need. But also you need the community to be involved, because you want this work to do something. It's not just a mapping project. It's not just a GIS project. You want this work to be driving change, and to be able to do that, you need to buy in, you need the volunteers, but you also need to let yourself be guided by community voices who have probably been fighting for stuff for a very long time, that hopefully you're already in coalition with, but now you really need to be in coalition with. The other big thing is that you just have to find out, are your records available in digital format? And like I said, digital for us doesn't mean that they necessarily have already been OCR'd. It just means that is your historical microfilm scanned, or your books. And what we usually do is we ask for everything from 1900 to 1970. We ask for pretty much every record type you got, because we found these in deeds, Torrens stuff. Not every community has Torrens. Plat maps, restriction agreements, wills, any kind of document you can imagine. So you have to get a wide net. And I think like getting access and working with public records like property records is its own thing. Like that also, it's not like a one-time thing, like someone's going to hand you the hard drive and then you'll never talk to the recorder again. This is an ongoing relationship you're going to have to develop with the records custodian, because inevitably you're not going to get everything you need the first time. You need to understand how their systems worked back in the day, but also today. And so I think like what we caution people about is that you need to develop a functional working relationship with the records custodian. If you're getting pushback on this, there's a real temptation to say these are public records and go really scorched earth and be really aggressive, and that's not going to serve you well. And unfortunately, that means a lot of times if you're running into that pushback, you need to slow down, get to know them, try to understand their constraints, but also sort of keep showing up and keep being persistent. I think, and that's the secret to success that we've known. And then the one more thing I'd say is I just reemphasize, you need to be willing to do the community engagement. You can't just sit in your office and expect volunteers to come. You need to get out there and build that volunteer base.
Yeah, thank you. Keeping a little bit with kind of the how do you get a project like this off the ground theme. You mentioned in one of your last slides about the NEH funding, and we have a question here that is essentially, you know, if you're maybe a professor at a small institution, are there other types of funding opportunities, grants that your team has targeted or found available that would support a work like this?
Well, I'll say, like, we're situated at the University of Minnesota, which is big R1 institution, but a lot of our best collaborators are actually at other institutions in the Twin Cities, and we've had very longstanding. Some of our most longstanding relationships are with St. Catherine University, and I'm blanking now on other universities, but like frankly, like a lot of the smaller universities have gotten more the community aspect of this, and so St. Kate's has really put Mapping Prejudice into the DNA of its instruction. And like, there's lots and lots of engagement with Mapping Prejudice in their classes. And they've leveraged that into a Mellon grant. Like they just got, several people at their institution got a Mellon grant for adapting this into their curriculum. And I don't actually know the specifics, so I don't want to say something incorrect. But also, like, figuring out what stories to tell around this research. Like, so whether you're part of a coalition that is actually doing deed research yourself, or if you're just digging into the stories in your community, that can be hugely helpful. And so a lot of times, like, so in St. Cloud, we're in the early stages of trying to get a project going there in partnership with College of St. Benedict and St. Cloud State up there. And like, we've got the technical platform. We'll probably be handling the technical end of it, but we really need them to both help us understand the local context, to have those local relationships, and to know the local history in a way that we're not going to. But for and unfortunately, like, I'm not a huge expert on the funding opportunities out there, but I know that, like, I think, like, figuring out ways to adapt this into your curriculum and to be out there in your community have been fruitful avenues for some of our collaborators.
Yeah, that's a great segue into our next question, which is essentially, you know, in light of some recent attacks on the idea of teaching or discussing these kinds of histories in school, how can teachers, professors, instructors, and their institutions incorporate this work without ruffling feathers, if that's possible?
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the educational resources your team has too.
Sure. So we've definitely produced educational guides. I will say that, like, this is a very real thing, and a lot of people are facing very serious pushback. And actually, this is again before my time, but during the Trump administration, my boss for a while was not able to speak to federal agencies because we were talking about structural racism. I mean, there's no way around the fact, right? We're talking about racial covenants. Like, if that's not structural racism, nothing is. And so I think, like, there are people in different parts of the country who are going to face really stiff challenges on this. And I don't think I can pretend to have the answer for those things. I think, but I think, like, as we can see, like, we're not making this up. These are facts. Like, these things happened. And so, like, I think trying to lean on as much as you can on the facts. But I think, like, for us, as I alluded to earlier, like, we try to go where we're invited. Like, we're not trying to, like, beat down the door and go into places that don't want to talk to us. And that's taken us a long way. And we've spoken to some audiences who have invited us to speak where we thought that this was going to be really hostile, or maybe we get a lot of pushback. And so far, like, if someone invites you into their space, they do that because they want to understand. And I sort of firmly believe that whether or not people have the vocabulary, or whether or not people are really up on the history of racism, they know that something doesn't add up. Something doesn't make sense. They're missing a piece of the puzzle. And I think, like, most of the time people have welcomed that additional information. And I think it's a balancing act because on the one hand, as I'm saying, like, these are things that people of color have been talking about as long as they've been going on. And often that message has not been received. And so I don't think I have the right to soften that message, like, in one sense. On the other hand, I don't think we're going into a space to be super confrontational. I think we recognize that people are in different stages of their understanding. And so I think for us, we we're explicit, we're factual, and that's that's all you can do. But I do want to say is like, I understand that people are working under ridiculous and incredible constraints, and I think as everyone on this call can attest, like whatever the political pressures, that's not going to make this history go away. It's still going to be what happened, and so we just have to keep doing the best we can and pushing that message out.
We have another question that just came in and says, thank you so much for the sober description of logistics on how to address this issue. Recently in a diversity journal club in Ohio State Psychiatry Department, this group discussed a Schwartz et al. 2021 article on examining the density of tobacco retailers in Columbus neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s. And the question is, are maps showing redlining enough of a start to begin like investigating the history of these deeds? And does redlining pretty much indicate that an area will have racial covenants in operating there?
Well, okay, it's a great question. So first I would say, like, at a conceptual level, redlining is kind of the opposite of racial covenants. Like, if you think about like an area that is redlined is one that where someone has determined that it is not worthy of investment for one reason or another. And so if you are familiar with the sort of the very prominent Hulk maps, the HOLC maps, they grade property on like on a A to D scale. And so D is your redlined areas, and A is like your most desirable neighborhoods. I think like there's definitely a correlation between this history and the redlining maps. And often the best neighborhoods, the A neighborhoods, will be these racially covenanted neighborhoods. That said, I think a lot of the recent scholarship around the redlining maps per se is pushing back a little bit on, can you use the Hulk maps themselves as a shorthand for racial exclusion? And there's a couple reasons for that. One is because, like, if I take the St. Paul redlining map, for example, there in the southern part along the river, there's this huge swath that is marked as red on the map. And if you look at the description of that area, it does include like this area. There's a Black community in this neighborhood. That's one of the reasons that this is given red. But redlining maps were not necessarily designed to just be a racial map. And the primary reason there's this huge area that's red is because this is a bluff alongside the river. And so there's a different reason that you would not build, you would not want to necessarily make a home loan there. It's because, like, well, it's going to fall into the river like that. And so I think like the redlining maps can tell us a lot about what someone's impression was of the racial dynamics in a neighborhood. But I think like, and it can point you along the way. But I think so we have another collaborator, Rebecca Walker, who just finished her PhD defense. Yay, Rebecca, who's been doing work in comparing some of the areas where, because of different histories, they have both racial covenants and were redlined. This is a relatively uncommon thing, but it does happen. And I think what her work shows is that the racial covenants are going to be a much more precise predictor of seeing some of these other indicators of divestment or investment. And so I think redlining maps are good. They're definitely something to use in your arsenal. But I would not say that the redlining maps are like the map of racism in your community, in much the same way that racial covenants are not the map of racism in your community. So I don't know if I can get back here. In the Twin Cities, yeah, this map here, you can see like I mentioned, like in the Twin Cities, like the whitest areas, like areas that had racial covenants are still among the whitest areas, but there's other areas that are still really white neighborhoods, including my neighborhood over here, that have some racial covenants, but are not like dominated by racial covenants in the same way. And so sometimes people have been really anxious for good reasons to use covenants as a way to do data analysis of racial exclusion. But I think it's like, you can't just say like, oh, well, my neighborhood doesn't have covenants, so phew, I'm good. Because what we see in my neighborhood in particular is fewer racial covenants, but a history of racial violence, like cross burnings and KKK meetings and people being run out by mobs. And I think what we sort of see is that neighborhoods in this time period you could think of them as taking option A or option B, like violence or covenants, or violence and covenants. And so it's important to understand that, like, that racial covenants also are not a map of the racism in your community. There's lots of ways that racism has shaped our communities. And this is, again, why you need to understand the specific history in your community, to unpick like all of the things going on in that history.
We're running out of time here, just a few more minutes, but we have another question that just came in. Does your team record other types of restrictive covenants included in the deeds? Things like use, price, size, agricultural, setback, other types of exclusionary components that could be of interest to planning scholars?
So right now, our primary purpose is definitely to map the racial covenants themselves, and that's in our published data. That's what's there. Part of our new process, though, in doing this, is that we are like maintaining the text that was in the documents that we've OCR'd, and so I think there's definitely room for secondary research on like what else is surrounding these covenants. So they're not in our published data sets, but I would love over the medium term to work on ways to access that larger set of structured data, for people to do that kind of secondary research, to empower that secondary research. So we are building like a text farm or whatever that could potentially be used for that. There's not an easy front door for that right now.
Yeah, and I just want to take time here for the last question, just to kind of bring us back around to the community engagement piece, which you've talked about being such an important component of this work. And I know that Mapping Prejudice team has a community advisory board. I think you recently started a community fellows program. And so I just maybe want to end with your thoughts on what are the roles and importance of those groups to making a project like this successful, and what kind of do you have on the horizon for those types of community engagements?
Yeah, so I'll start with our community fellows program, which is what we had our inaugural cohort this year, and I think we're going to do it next year too. And this sort of came, it started from our sort of understanding that a lot of the work in our community has been like our work has really resonated strongly with white people, to be honest. Like, and on the one hand, what we've heard from communities of color is, on the one hand, that's good. Like, white people are the ones who need to do the work on this. They're the ones who don't understand the history, and it's their turn to do some work. But at the same time, we do want to understand like what are other ways that what are the ways in which this research can be directly useful to communities of color. And so part of the goal with the community fellows program was to help us understand what else can this work do in the world. And I think our first cohort is just finishing up, and we've learned a lot about that. And I think there's more to learn about that. Also with the community fellows program, part of the goal was to just resource people doing good work in the community, which people who work in a university environment may recognize this. It's actually very difficult to do in the structure of university bureaucracy. And I think that's definitely one of our early findings, is that even when the university wants to resource the community, that's not how we're set up. And I think that was a really interesting finding. On our community advisory board, like it's a great question about like what's that for, and I think like partly it's for us to like keep feelers out in the community with people that we particularly trust. But so I'll give an example. Is like recently we've been having meetings with some labs who say like we'd love to help you out by bringing in new tools, or maybe finding different ways to scale up, or like can we just have AI do this instead? And as I've articulated, like we have opinions about this, right? Like we feel like the way that we're doing this is the way we want to do this for specific reasons. But this is a great opportunity for us to go back to the community advisory board and tell them, hey, this is what we're hearing. Like people are asking us about this. Check us on this, because it's not about us. Like we are still a mostly white team. And like we really need their feedback on, hey, like just because we might want to do the work in a certain way doesn't mean that that's the final answer. And so I think that's part of it. And so like we just think that's necessary, both for our credibility, but it also helps us a lot. And we really value like having that buy-in, and sort of like sometimes like members of the community advisory board have said, hey, can you talk to this group, or hey, can you talk to this group? And that also helps us prioritize where like if a request is coming in that way, that's a huge priority for us to deal with. So.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for this, and thank you so much to everyone for attending and asking such great questions. As Jerica mentioned at the beginning, we'll have a recording that we'll be following up with folks, so you'll have access to the recording. And then I just wanted to mention we have additional events in the Race and Place Summer Series in June, July, and August. So just take a look at Cura's event calendar, and we hope to see you at those as well. Michael, just thank you so much again. We really appreciate your presentation and the work that you and your team are doing.
Well, thank you very much for everyone for being here and for inviting us. And yeah, talk to some of you soon, I hope.
All right. Thanks, everybody.